about things differently to how previous generations have thought about them, and then putting those ideas into action. So the challenge for us in this course is to help give you a platform to start to make those differences from. And the goal that we have in offering this course is to empower you to make change in whatever arena of activity you plan to go into. We want to give you a strengthened set of knowledge and skills to bring about change for the better. I've got a couple of quotes here about forest policy as a subset of environmental policy, and I'll use them because they make more general points about nature and environmental policy, just to reinforce some points that Richard's already made. There was a time when foresters, from the time that I was educated here 30 years ago, there was a time when foresters seemed to think that forestry was about trees, and it was about cutting up trees without wearing safety boots, for example, sort of thing that you should never do. It's not, we now know, about trees. That's part of what forestry is about. It's about how society chooses to value and use the trees that forests are. So if your perspective, in this case as a forester, but more generally as an environmentalist, is just on the natural systems, you've only got part of the picture. If you want to have an impact on conservation and sustainable management of those forests or of the environment more generally, you've got to understand how people value forests, how their consumption decisions influence the way that forests are used, and you've got to be able to change people's behaviour if you want to change the way that the environment's managed. So you've got to bring the natural and the social sciences together. And in doing that, you're trying to find some sort of balance between what are often quite competing interests in our society, between interests of all of us who have high levels of paper and wood consumption. You probably know that per capita consumption of forest products, as an example, increases exponentially with wealth. So Australians and Americans, Japanese, have very high levels of wood consumption per capita, maybe 2 tonnes equivalent per person per year, compared to people in China and India who might use about 100 kilograms per person per year. So our wealth and our consumption have very direct impacts on the environment, and we've got to find ways to balance what we want materially with what we want in terms of conservation of environment. And finally, a quote from an American political scientist who works in forests, Jeff Rom, just to reiterate a point that Richard's made about the notion of sustainability. Sustainability is an accepted societal goal, at least accepted rhetorically, but it's an inherently political concept. Your definition of sustainability implies that some people gain and some people lose. It might be different to my definition of sustainability. So Jeff Rom points out very clearly here that sustainability is an inherently political term, and resolving sustainability issues are inherently political because they involve choices, as Richard said, about the allocation of scarce resources. So this course is inherently political, and we don't make any excuses for that. In fact, it could not be anything else. So just a couple of pictures to illustrate, I think these aren't copied in the slides, a couple of pictures to illustrate what I'm saying in real terms. We now understand that Australian forest, this is a picture by the convict artist Joseph Lycett, was painted in 1817, so not long after European people began to settle Australia, and it's entitled something like Aboriginals Hunting Kangaroos. What's interesting in this picture is that you see very clearly illustrated the use of fire to manage the landscape. Aboriginal people used fire as their principal management tool. And we now know, through research work that's been done here at ANU as well as elsewhere, that their use of fire had a big impact on the forests of Australia and on what we now understand, what we now call biodiversity. That the pattern of forests in the landscape, the structure of forests, the composition of the forest was influenced by Aboriginal people's use of fire. And when Europeans first came to Australia, it took them a long time to realise that. And when European invasion of Australia displaced Aboriginal people, the landscape began to change in ways that people didn't expect, because one of the principal management regimes that had shaped the landscape was taken away. I spent the last 6 months in Canada, in Western Canada, in Vancouver, on study leave, and I had good fortune to visit the Queen Charlotte Islands, the Haida Gwaii, on the west coast of British Columbia, where there's an extraordinarily rich First Nations culture that's clearly very heavily dependent on wood. This is a picture taken about a century ago in one of the First Nations villages called Skidegate, and you can see the ceremonial and the practical use of wood in that picture. So these people too had an impact on forests, and in their case though the impact was probably much more contained. It was related to the harvesting of cedar trees to use cultural and livelihood values. So my point with these two pictures is that in very different ways people historically have impacted upon forests in ways that sometimes we more recent immigrants are very slow to understand. Another point that I want to make, again with an illustration from the Haida people. This is a carving by a very famous Haida artist. It's a creation myth of the Haida people. It's carved out of old growth yellow cedar, which is a very important tree for Haida people. But to me it's a wonderful symbol of the cultural and symbolic value of forests, in this case to that particular society, but there are many other ways in which forests as an important ecosystem are important to other societies, to our contemporary society. And I believe that those cultural values that forests have underlie much of the challenge that we face in resolving forest policy issues. And I think that similarly, cultural differences, cultural values in our society, the difference between urban and rural dwellers, for example, in a very quick way, underlie many of the rural environmental policy challenges that we face. And here's a picture from the Sydney Morning Herald magazine a few years ago about Tasmania's old-growth forests. A very eloquent article by Bob Ellis, who wrote Paul Keating's speeches, and it says, if you can't read the text, when our ancient forests are empty and silent, how will we quiet the whispering in our hearts? An allusion to Henry Reynolds' book, The Whispering in Our Hearts, about the relationship between Australia and European and Aboriginal Australians. So very strong emotional and cultural values associated with particular parts of our environment that prove very challenging to resolve in policy terms. And last week I and a number of the students in this course were in Tasmania at an international conference about old forests and how we should manage them. I'll skip over that slide. The flow of argument I want to make is in this slide. In my view, it's very helpful to understand some of the underlying thinking in societies about the relationship between nature and culture if we're going to understand environmental policy. And you might want to have a look at the website here, which I'm afraid didn't print out in the slide, so I'll write it on the board. There's a whole body of work about understanding the relationship between societies, culture, the culture of Aboriginal Australians, the culture of European Australians, the culture of people in the Indian subcontinent, and how that culture relates to nature. You're probably aware of some of this work. This is from a research project led by an academic called Jim Proctor, and the slide illustrates a continuum between nature and culture, illuminated in different ways by different scientific disciplines, different academic disciplines. So the physical or the life sciences, the sort of things that ecologists study, illuminate one part of our understanding of the relation between nature and culture. The social sciences illuminate another part, the humanities illuminate a third. And I guess what I've come to realise as I've been working more in environmental policy, which I began by thinking about as in a rather political science sort of way, is that in fact to understand and really get to the bottom of some of the environmental policy challenges that we